Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to share with you the results of my master's degree. And to do this, I would like to start asking a question. Do any of you know where Nemo ended up after his long journey? As many of you probably guessed, yes, he ended up at his anemone, or what we would call his home. And what about Dory? Well, I hope this isn't a spoiler, but Dory ended up at home as well. And like Nemo and Dory, millions of fish worldwide return home. And not only charismatic species, but also targeted ones, like the larvae of this stripy snapper, as you can see in these arrows. This process of larvae returning home is called local retention, and it's crucial for the persistence of populations. As we all know, coral reefs provide numerous goods and services to human societies. However, with human impacts escalating, all these services are at risk. One management measure that is used to protect, at least from some impacts, are marine reserves. And as you can see in this graph, they have increasingly been established for the management and conservation of coastal marine habitats. And this is especially true for coral reef regions, where many communities lack of enough resources to implement other management measures. However, we have realized there isn't single reserves, but networks of reserves that we need. And the basis for this comes from metapopulation theory. In patch environments, such as coral reefs, many populations persist as metapopulations. So though one patch becomes extinct, it can still persist as long as there's recolonization among patches. When we implement a marine reserve network, either if it's for fisheries or for conservation purposes, we aim to protect at least the fraction of this metapopulation that enables persistence as a whole. To predict metapopulation persistence, we normally use spatially explicit models. And many of these have been used to provide the best guidelines of reserve network configurations. However, these models require extensive knowledge of the species under study. They require fecundity, survivorship, connectivity, density dependence, mortality, which is data that sadly isn't available for all species and regions, and we have to take assumptions that could potentially impact important reserve design outcomes. Network analysis, which applies the mathematical foundations of graph theory to study the relationship between nodes connected by edges, has been extensively applied in a variety of disciplines, such as to study, for example, social interactions, where people might represent the nodes and communication, the connections. It's being used in transportation systems, in neural connections, and we can even see it in Avatar. Recently, it is gaining importance in metapopulation ecology and conservation planning, where patches or subpopulations might be treated as nodes, and the connections between them, such as larval dispersal, are treated as edges. All studies that are starting to use this approach have emphasized that the network have some easily measurable properties that we also call network metrics that can act as good predictors for metapopulation persistence. They have found, for example, that the number of nodes in the network, the amount of flux that flows through it, or the symmetry in connectivity are metrics that can act as proxies for persistence. And the more metrics that are analyzed, more are the ones that are found or suggested as being good predictors. However, when we were looking at these studies, we realized that most used idealized networks, such as random or regular, instead of real-world networks. And none of the metrics that were being explored included the process of local retention, the connection of a patch with itself, which we know is crucial for the persistence of populations. So in our study, what we did was assess the performance of network metrics as predictors for metapopulation persistence. But we did this by creating new metrics and modifying some of existing ones for them to account for the local retention process, by using a real-world network instead of an idealized one, and then by varying the connectivity patterns of this real-world network to test the robustness of our results. To do this, we used the larval dispersal connectivity matrix between 33 reserve patches from the central Philippines, together with demography estimates of a targeted coral reef fish species in the region, Chlorurus bleakeri. We combined this data and created our virtual real-world network, where each node represents a subpopulation within a reserve, and the connections between nodes represent larval dispersal probabilities. Then, to look at the relationship between persistence and the network metrics, from this virtual real-world network, we randomly subtracted 20 subnetworks of 10 nodes with their respective connectivity patterns, and for each of these subnetworks, we calculated persistence and 24 network metrics. This allowed us to see what proportion of the variation that we've seen in persistence could be explained by each of the different metrics that we analysed. So how did we calculate persistence? Well, what you really need to know is that we used an age-structured metapopulation model where you incorporate fecundity, survivorship, and mortality for one patch. Then you combine all patches together with the connectivity matrix, and we calculated persistence as the long-run growth rate of the metapopulation. For the network approach, we calculated a total of 24 network metrics. 8 that have been found as good predictors for persistence, 9 that have been suggested as being good predictors, 4 metrics that we modified to account for the local retention process, such as total edge weight, that was the sum of the black arrows, and we easily modified it for it to be the sum of the black and the blue arrows and called it total flags. And then 3 new metrics we created: total self-influx, or the total amount of local retention a network has, the ratio between self-influx influx, that details how much of what a node is receiving it's actually from itself, and the ratio between self-influx outflux, that details how much of what a node is sending returns to itself. So if we look at the results, and we look at the just squared R value on the y-axis, that shows the proportion of variation seen in persistence explained by each of the different metrics on the x-axis. We can see in blue that the metrics that better explain persistence all included the process of local retention, whereas those metrics that have been found to be good predictors for persistence weren't good predictors for this real-world network, and neither those that have been suggested. It wasn't until we got current metrics, modified them for them to account for the local retention process, that these become better predictors. For example, if we look at the relationship between persistence on the y-axis and symmetry on the x-axis, where each dot represents a subnetwork that we analysed, we can see that the symmetry metric only explains around an 11% of the variation that we see in persistence. However, if we get the symmetry metric, modify it for it to account for the local retention process, now the symmetry metric explains a 77% of the variation that we see. Leaving the modified metrics apart and looking at the new metrics we created, we can see that one of them in particular, total self-influx, has a squared R value of nearly 0.99. What this is telling us is that much of the variation that we're seeing in persistence can be explained by the amount of local retention a network has. So metrics included in the process of local retention were the best predictors of persistence for our real-world network. However, we realized this network had particular features that could be driving these results. We saw, for example, that the strength of self-connections was normally higher than the strength of node interconnections. In other words, the connection of a patch with itself was normally stronger than the connections among nodes. And this can be seen, for example, in this bottom node. You can see that the strength of self-connection is in white, which means it's strong, and the strength of node interconnections are in lighter blues. Another feature that we found on this real-world network was that nodes with high self-connections were typically the ones with high node interconnections. And this can be seen, for example, in the same node. It's the node with high self-connection in white, but it's also the biggest node, the one with highest or the strongest node interconnections. So to test the robustness of our results, we varied the connectivity patterns of our network And here I'm only going to show 2 examples. One thing that we did is shuffle the off-diagonals of the connectivity matrix. In other words, the connections among nodes. This allowed for nodes with high self-connections to not be the same ones with high node interconnections. Another thing that we did was shuffle the entire connectivity matrix. And this allowed for the strength of self-connections to have similar values to the node interconnections. In summary, what we found was that when the strength of self-connections was higher than the node interconnections, it was our new metrics, the ones that focused entirely on local retention, that become the best predictors of persistence. However, when the strength of self-connections was similar to the one of node interconnections, it wasn't our new metrics that performed well, but our modified ones that include the process of local retention. However, in all cases that we analysed, metrics included in the process of local retention outperformed the relatives not including it. So what do I want you to take home from this talk today? Well, I want you to take home that metrics can easily be modified to account for the local retention process. This was not done previously, and this information is becoming increasingly available. When we include this information, metrics become the best predictors of metapopulation persistence for our real-world network, but also when we varied all the connectivity patterns. So if we really want to use the network approach in conservation planning, it is time to let our fish return home. Before I finish, I would like to thank my supervisors of my master's degree and also people that provided data and constructive comments throughout the project, and also funding sources for funding my master's degree and also supporting my supervisors. Thank you.